Hello, scholars! My name is Dr. Kara Stillen, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we talked about Reconstruction. In this video, we're going to discuss industrialization within the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, American society was ready to industrialize. The U.S. had abundant natural resources such as flowing rivers that could be used to harness water power. Vast forests provided a multitude of different types of timber that could be used to build homes, furniture, or other buildings. Coal was used to create energy even though it produced massive air pollution, and iron helped to stabilize buildings as well as create machinery. Raw materials were not the only component involved in industrialization. Labor was the other major element involved in the equation, and there was plenty of labor in the U.S. at this time because of immigration. From 1870 to 1880, 8 million immigrants arrived in the U.S., most in search of work. From 1890 to 1914, nearly 16 million immigrants came in search of a better life. Up until 1880, a majority of immigrants came from Britain, Ireland, and Germany. These were called old immigrants. Immigrants that came after 1880 were known as new immigrants. These individuals were Italian, Eastern European Jews, Russians, and Poles. Sometimes individuals in the U.S. sent money to their relatives to get them to come to America. If they didn't send money, they often sent pictures showing how well they were doing in the new nation. Immigrants made up more than 50% of the population. These immigrants had differences in religion, nationality, interests, and culture, which often made for difficult times in the workforce. Generally, ethnicity tended to dictate what forms of work an immigrant could do in America during this time. Germans often became bakers, tailors, built homes, or made shoes. Irish immigrants tended to take jobs in mining industries. Jewish individuals tended to work in garment industries. Those from Italy, Russia, and Poland worked dirty jobs in factories, steel mills, on the dock, or as construction workers. Black Americans got the lowest paying jobs as servants, janitors, and laborers. Before new immigrants arrived in America, individuals with wealth tended to live in the cities. Wealthy upper-class individuals moved to the outskirts of the city when the working class moved closer to work. Poor individuals tried to live as close to their work as they could because they couldn't afford transportation to get them there. This caused a clear distinction between the condition of the inner cities compared to the suburbs. While the suburbs were lined with grand mansions, parks, middle to upper class homes, monuments, and good-looking businesses, the inner cities became unsanitary and crowded. There was quite a high death rate within the urban areas as indoor plumbing opened up to alleyways and dumped sewage into the alleys. When women did not have access to water, they gathered water from outdoor hydrants and carried it inside their living space. Even though there were horrendous living conditions, various ethnicities were able to create a sense of community in various areas. Germans gathered in saloons and created singing societies. Jewish individuals gathered at synagogues and at schools that taught Hebrew. Black individuals faced the worst of the living conditions, but still created churches and communities that provided support. Between the inner city and the suburbs tended to live the lower middle class. These were salespersons, tradespeople, clerks, as well as shopkeepers. These individuals rented their homes and business spaces and could sometimes buy them. The locations had more privacy than living in the inner city. They usually also had indoor plumbing, garage collection, and were cleaner than the inner city. These individuals also had the ability to buy more consumer goods and had more leisure time. The rights of women began to change near the beginning of the 20th century. Women with leisure time joined charity groups, various clubs, and literary societies. Women also attained higher educations that were equivalent to men. In 1890, more than 10% of college graduates were women. In 1900, nearly 20% were college graduates. Women weren't allowed to enter any job in the workforce, but they now could become social workers, teachers, nurses, work in department stores, or conduct office work. Educated women tend to have less children, and the divorce rate increased to 1 out of 12 as women refused to remain in bad marriages. There were also changes for men beginning in the 20th century. New job opportunities meant that men could now gain employment as salesmen, shipping clerks, accountants, and shop owners. White-collar jobs now required an education. The number of public schools and colleges greatly increased at this time. Johns Hopkins, the University of Chicago, as well as other research facilities were formed. Associations such as the American Bar Association and the American Medical Association created requirements for their memberships. The need for lawyers, insurance agents, and bankers, as well as accountants, became evident. The larger a company became, the more management positions were sought that often meant higher incomes for those that attained them. In a majority of the cases, those males that were white and were born in America tended to have the highest paying jobs. They were the individuals that had access to the highest educations as well as inherited wealth. Working class men rarely ever made enough money for their families to survive. Women often couldn't work outside the home because they had little children to watch and tons of domestic work to complete. 20% of children between the ages of 8 to 14 had to go to work. Much of the time, young daughters went to work to provide for the education of their brothers. Middle and upper class women were appalled by the child labor, but often believed it to be the fault of the mother and the father for not taking care of their own children. Children often worked in other homes doing domestic chores, but they were also hired in factory jobs, in food processing, in textiles, and also in meatpacking plants. Sometimes working class families had to send women to work. Women were paid much less than men and were often discriminated against. Some women worked at home and sewed and repaired clothing in order to earn money. Most tended to work in factories, sometimes 8 to 14 hours a day. When women couldn't get a job, they sometimes would turn to prostitution in order to pay the bills. Prostitution increased substantially at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Those women that were able to stay at home did not have an easy life. They took care of their children and had to shop for food each day because they didn't have refrigerators or freezers to keep food from spoiling. Laundry was also difficult because the pump for water was usually outside. In order to get clothes for the children, women often had to bargain with other women or go to secondhand stores in order to clothe her children. When there was room, women often took in boarders, which meant they wouldn't have privacy. This meant they had another mouth to feed and extra laundry to do, but the money was often worth it. With so many individuals working, including men, women, and children, the nation began to increase in wealth, generally to the benefit of owners and professionals. Communication and transportation also helped the nation to industrialize quickly. As technological advances continued, the railroad increased in speed, had greater safety for passengers, and were sought out for product delivery. Products could move from location to location with great ease. Some railroads could reach 50 miles per hour, which greatly reduced the time it took to get from one place to another. The railroad helped to bring various people together, making business deals that wouldn't have been possible without it. The city of Chicago became able to send meat to various parts of the nation. The city of Minneapolis sent various types of grain and flour to others. The Great Plains cities sent wheat to other parts of the nation. There was now mass production and mass consumption throughout the country. The railroad itself hired thousands of workers and had great organizational needs. Owners rarely ever met their employees, and sometimes even managers didn't have face-to-face contact. For 100 years, the railroad helped industrialize the nation in a way that had never been expected. The building of the railroad was not as smooth as it ended up after 100 years. Companies knew that they could become wealthy by building tracks to gain subsidies and therefore created tracks that had no logical reasoning for their placement. Companies were only concerned with being awarded with wealthy contracts. The purpose of the subsidies was to gain tracks across the West as quickly as possible, but the haphazard placement meant that many tracks would later be abandoned or rebuilt to match gauges. Many of the early tracks only traveled 30 to 50 miles and had schedules that did not coincide with other railroads. There were separate depots. They used different gauges, the distance between each rail, the standard was 6 feet, and did not cooperate with other lines. This was difficult because trains in one location could not run on the tracks of other trains. The larger trains eventually swallowed the smaller railroad companies, and their tracks eventually were integrated. Eventually, they set standard schedules, had common signals, and used a common gauge. It was this standardization that meant the railroad would eventually reach ranchers, farmers, and factory owners in various rural locations. The government had helped to finance the railroad and because of this was able to require trains to carry government troops, the U.S. mail, and government products to be transported at greatly reduced rates. The government saved itself billions of dollars by doing this. The railroad was not the only industry that thrived and changed the face of the nation. By 1900, there were over 1,000 factories within the United States that produced goods on a massive scale. Most industry was located in the Northeast. Andrew Carnegie, who owned a steel industry, realized that he would earn more from his products if he bought up places with raw materials as well as transportation and packaging companies. Carnegie did not want to be dependent upon other business owners and their prices for his ability to thrive. This became known as vertical integration. John D. Rockefeller used horizontal integration in his business model. He created Standard Oil and cut his prices so low to the point that he wasn't even making a profit to drive out his competition and put them out of business. He would then buy their business or just let them go bankrupt and would consume all their customers and then raise the prices. Monopolies had not yet been outlawed and Standard Oil was able to take control of 84% of the nation's oil sales. Even though industry produced massive amounts of goods at a lesser cost, there was a downside to workers. Factory jobs were often dangerous and workers worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their work environments were dirty and hazardous, and workers felt like they were slaves, performing monotonous acts. Owners and managers did not look out for the health and well-being of their workers. Women who spent hours bending over a sewing machine often developed curved spines. Those that worked in mines worked in conditions where the temperature often rose above 100 degrees. The mines smelled of garbage, urine, and feces. Many mine workers developed lung issues because they lacked any form of protection over their noses and mouths. Every year, over 30,000 workers died in factories due to accidents. On the railroad, they lost about 6,000 people a year. When there were accidents, the owners and managers were not held responsible. The lack of workers' rights and hazardous conditions of the time led to thousands of strikes near the end of the 1800s. In 1877, the railroad workers were the first to stage a strike that ended up violent. The strike erupted when railroad workers cut wages due to difficulties within the economy. The railroad workers destroyed railroad property and refused to allow the trains to move. There were nearly 100 deaths by the time that federal troops arrived and stopped the strike. Striking became a new way for workers to show their dissatisfaction. Between 1880 and 1910, more than 30,000 strikes took place. These strikes were often violent. Workers wanted higher wages and shorter hours. In 1866, the National Labor Union, NLU, was formed in order to protect workers and bring more profits to those that worked the land and produced the goods. The NLU supported women's rights, the creation of cooperatives, as well as temperance. The goal of these unions were to help organize strikes and protest and to create goals for workers to push toward. The organization also wanted to establish an 8-hour day for workers, but this union diminished when the Depression of 1873 took place and people's focus went elsewhere. When the economy of the Depression of 1873 started to recover, a new organization called the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor came into existence. Terence V. Powderly was the leader of the Knights of Labor, and he helped workers to push for an 8-hour day, allowing workers more time to pursue alternative items. Everyone was allowed to join this union. Skilled and unskilled workers were both allowed to join. Black and white people were both allowed to join, as well as men and women. The Knights of Labor helped unorganized workers of the Union Pacific Railroad to gain better wages. They also helped workers in a strike against the Missouri Pacific Railroad. It was in 1886 that the Knights of Labor gained the greatest amount of union members when the Haymarket Riot broke out. Workers at the McCormick factory protested for better working conditions and wages. As the crowds grew bigger, the Chicago police were sent, and just as they arrived, a bomb went off and killed 7 policemen. Anarchists had used the protest to create unrest, which helped to destroy the Knights of Labor and its reputation. Eventually, Powderly recognized that he could not control anarchists that use worker protests to create trouble and he became tired of the constant problems that employers created for him. Just as the Knights of Labor was beginning to decline, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, was created in 1886. Its leader was Samuel Gompers, who believed that skilled workers should remain in skilled positions. He also pushed for higher wages, safety within the workplace, the right to strike and organize, as well as shorter working hours for employees. The AFL membership grew substantially within 15 years. Gompers did not allow unskilled workers or black individuals to become part of the organization. When women tried to become part of the organization, the men threatened to quit if they were accepted. This led to the creation of the International Ladies Garment Worker Union for women, but a majority of the leadership positions were held by men. Many strikes were won and many strikes were lost. As technology advanced and mechanization increased, employers cut workers out, which brought about violent strikes. Violence took place quite often and led to blacklisting. Strikebreakers and armed guards fought against Union men. One of the worst strikes that ever took place happened in 1892 near Pittsburgh at Homestead Steel Mills. Henry Clay Frick had been put in charge of the Homestead Steel Mills by Andrew Carnegie. Frick realized that many workers had joined the union and wanted to break the union's foothold within the business, but negotiations had resulted in multiple failures. Frick lost his patience and decided to give the workers an ultimatum. He told the workers to accept the wage cuts or that every single one of them would be replaced with other workers. Frick knew the workers would retaliate with the union, and he hired 300 armed Pinkerton guards to surround the plant and guard the business. On July 6th, armed steel workers arrived, and a gun battle ensued. Pinkertons and workers died from gunfire, and eventually the Pinkertons retreated. Frick then asked the governor to send in 8,000 military troops to help crush the union. Frick believed that he had won, but an assassination attempt almost took his life. In 1893, a bad depression created problems for railroad workers. Eugene Debs collaborated several groups of workers to create a United American Railroad Union, ARU, and within a year more than 100,000 workers joined. They won a couple of strikes, but had trouble when faced with the Pullman Palace Car Company in Chicago. This company cut workers' wages by 33% and laid off many employees. The workers struck, and Debs directed workers to not stop production and to have a nonviolent protest. The products of the company were boycotted, and it desperately hurt the company. General Motors Association, GMA, came to the rescue of Pullman by hiring 2,500 strikebreakers and pushed the state and federal governments to assist them in stopping the strikes. President Cleveland sent troops to crush the strikers, and violence took over the area. Many workers were killed during the strikes. Samuel Gompers refused to come to the aid of Debs, and the strike collapsed. Debs was also hauled into court and was found guilty and sentenced. When strikes were not successful, discrimination amongst immigrants often took place. During the 1870s and 1880s, Chinese Americans experienced some of the worst discrimination in the nation. When white workers in the West started losing their jobs, they blamed Chinese workers for the loss of their employment. Whites began killing Chinese people that came from Asia in order to gain employment. More than 250,000 Chinese immigrants came to the U.S. between 1860 and 1900. Many of these Chinese individuals were men that left their wives and family to earn money and send it back to their families. They worked jobs that no one in the U.S. wanted to work. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, stating that no more immigrants from China could come to America for a 10-year period. This was later extended and then made permanent in 1902. Okay, we're going to end the video here. If you like the video, please click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. I appreciate all of you, all the listeners, and I hope these videos make academic subjects easier to understand for you. Please have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or night, and I will talk with you soon.